Now, for more on education for refugees, I'm joined by Sarnata Reynolds, international human rights lawyer and director for Strategy for Humanity, a consulting firm. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, as we're understanding here, millions of children are growing up without this normal or traditional schooling. What sort of problems does this raise in the short term?
Well, in the short term, of course, so many of these children have gone through just exceptional trauma that really an adult can't even imagine. And all children need structure and just a normal day. So when you have kids who don't have that and on top of that are coming with trauma, they suffer even more. That school structure would help them to at least have a schedule and have some sense of normalcy. So they're missing that. Obviously, they're also missing out on basic life skills. Learning in a school is about obviously reading and writing, but it's also about learning how to collaborate, how to share, how to get along, how to resolve conflict, and they're not getting to do that. And of course, as importantly, because they're not in school, they're more vulnerable to trafficking, they're more vulnerable to child labor, they're more vulnerable to child marriage. So not being educated has a lot of fallout that's negative for children.
And as we look at some of that fallout, without this basic education, and as you mentioned, the social skills that they also learn, how do countries like Syria or Libya or the Ukraine plan to compete, say, 20 years from now when these children are of working age?
I think the reality is that Syria, anyway, in particular, will not be able to compete in 20 years. That's just a reality. Syria, hopefully, will be in the process of rebuilding by then. Ukraine has more than 1 million displaced. That's true of other countries as well. It depends on how bad the infrastructure is destroyed, how many families are separated and terrorized. All of that matters for the future. But right now, it doesn't look good.
Now, what about these young people? They're fleeing their homelands. They're trying to transition in between these countries. Besides the political intervention that's needed, what sort of educational resources are actually needed?
So, there's a few problems, of course. There are financial issues, of course. There are millions of children now all around the world who are in need of education. But a lot of them also, it's not just getting a school to go into. They need help just retransitioning back in. So if you think of kids not just from Syria, but kids from Central America, many of whom are making their way to the United States, a lot of them have been out of school for a year or 2 or 3 while they were in hiding inside their country. So they are going to deal with trauma, with not being able to concentrate. Language can be an issue, of course. The ability to just pay for transportation and for school lunches is an issue. So all of these compound. And an intervention really has to be mindful of all of these dynamic factors that are going to compete to make it much harder for these children to learn. But of course, it doesn't mean they can't. They can. It's just there has to be an intervention that is mindful of their experience.
And being that they do have that added trauma on top of the fact that they're in a place that they may not be familiar with, and on top of that, having to get an education, you're finding that, as we saw in the report, some children choosing between what I need right now, how do I pay for food for my family? And so the idea of perhaps an education may seem something that they really just don't have the luxury of. So what do you think can be done to make schools a more attractive option so that they can really invest in their future?
Yeah, I think schools are an attractive option. Syrians actually had a really strong, robust, historical education system. And, people were really well educated there. It wasn't uncommon to have 2nd and 3rd languages. So it's not, I think at this point, it is a luxury, unfortunately. So that's true that children are having to make it's not their choice, but families are having to make the choice to have children go out and work. And that changes if adults have the legal right to work in countries where they're being hosted. That's why adults aren't working now. They get arrested. A lot of adult males who go into the workplace, picking up informal work, get arrested and then get put in detention, and that obviously makes things worse for families. Children aren't as likely to get arrested, and so they're safer to go out and work. It's unfortunately, that's the reality of not allowing people to work.
A terrible choice that people are obviously forced to make there. Now, another thing that we're seeing is some of these TECs, these temporary education centers. We saw them in Turkey to help educate Syrian refugees. So in terms of the sort of quality of education that they're getting, what can they really expect there?
Well, it's hard. It's not a full school day. Oftentimes, like in Turkey, it's Syrian teachers or Syrian people who are able to teach. but they're not allowed to work legally, so they're not getting paid. It's basically a stipend or a volunteer opportunity. This is true in Malaysia, where I was as well, looking at the situation for Rohingya children. That was also volunteers who really wanted to help and doing their best, but with very little resources and with inconsistent money, which means they can't plan curriculum.
And speaking of that, then, how are these getting funded?
They oftentimes are privately funded. So it could be private individuals from communities, which was often the case in Malaysia. It could be different states. Gulf states have been quite involved in this in Turkey. It really just depends. It could come through the UN. It could come through government funding. But it is definitely, it's a ad hoc, and it's sort of one fund on top of another, which is not a good way, obviously, to fund education.
Definitely needs more of a multi-pronged approach. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarnata Reynolds from Strategy for Humanity.
If you like what you just saw, follow us on social media and visit our website, cctv-america.com.